Thank you for joining us to learn about the National Voluntary Farm Level Crop, Biosecurity Standard, and Producer Guide for the fruit and tree nut industries. This presentation is brought to you by the Canadian Plant Health Council, which plays a vital role in supporting plant health across Canada, working with industry stakeholders and producers, federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and academia. In the following slides, we'll dive into the topic of biosecurity and why it is important. We will then go over the Farm Level Crop Biosecurity Standard and Producer Guide and how implementing their key target outcomes can support fruit and tree nut producers in managing plant health risks and protecting crops from pests and subsequent crop losses. The standard is voluntary, but is a critical component for maintaining crop health and sustainability in agriculture. Farm-level biosecurity is a series of management practices designed to prevent, minimize, and manage the introduction, spread, and release of plant pests. Plant pests can harm crops by causing reduced yields and increasing production costs. A proactive strategy to protecting crops from plant pests enables optimal crop health and productivity and is critical in maintaining the sustainability and profitability of the Canadian agricultural sector. It also ensures continued access to domestic and export markets and assists in opening new markets. Implementing strong biosecurity management practices is the first and often most effective line of defense to reduce risks from plant pests. Why is farm-level biosecurity important? As mentioned, plant pests have a direct impact on the profitability of farming by reducing yields and increasing costs. In addition, the success of Canada's agricultural exports is linked to the excellent phytosanitary status of our crops and crop products. Phytosanitary certification confirms that Canadian plants and plant products are free from pests of concern of the importing countries and are compliant with the relevant international standards and regulations for plant health, ensuring safe trade and preventing the spread of harmful pests across borders. Demonstrating minimal phytosanitary risk is key to maintaining existing export markets, as well as opening and expanding new markets. By adopting biosecurity measures, you help ensure that Canadian products remain competitive on the world stage. Farm-level biosecurity doesn't have to be complicated. Incorporating simple measures into your everyday farm management practices can go a long way. Small, consistent actions are the most effective way to protect your crops and prevent the costly consequences of pest outbreaks. By making biosecurity part of your daily routine, you safeguard your farm and your future. The primary responsibility for biosecurity falls on farm owners and managers. You are the ones who ensure that crops are protected. Developing a written biosecurity plan is encouraged, and this can be done with the help of crop specialists or consultants. It is also important to get cooperation from visitors and service personnel. Everyone on the farm should follow biosecurity protocols. A biosecurity plan starts with a thorough risk assessment to evaluate potential threats. These would include monitoring everyone entering, working on, and exiting the farm, examining pathways for the introduction, spread, or escape of pests of concerns. This includes pests that are already established in the area or invasive pests, those pests that are not known to occur in the region, and identifying preventative methods to manage or minimize the risk of these pests. The plan should focus on three key components. First, exclusion or preventing pests from entering the farm. Second, management or preventing pests from spreading within the farm. And third, containment or ensuring pests do not escape from the farm and spread to neighboring locations. A farm biosecurity plan will include elements associated with the farm location and layout, operational routines, and crop health management practices. It is important to keep in mind that each farm will have different risks, so your plan should be customized to address your own specific challenges. A national farm-level biosecurity planning guide was put in place to encourage producers to implement the use of sound crop production practices that protect crop health and maximize profits, although they do not guarantee protection from all potential pests. The planning guide identifies the key elements, considerations, and critical points of biosecurity intervention that apply to producers and handlers of agricultural crops. These preventive guidelines are not all-inclusive, but are generally accepted as beneficial management practices for most agricultural crops. One biosecurity plan will not fit the needs of every farm operation, and thus biosecurity plans should be developed to meet the specific needs of each farm. Each operation should incorporate these practices into daily routines that are appropriate for specific high-risk pests. Producers are also encouraged to review their production practices in relation to pest prevention on a frequent basis and ensure their strategies are carried out. An effective biosecurity plan is one that is flexible and open to new knowledge and technology as it becomes available. There are 4 national voluntary farm-level biosecurity standards and guides for crop-based sectors: grains and oilseeds, potato, greenhouse, nursery and floriculture, and fruit and tree nut. The crop biosecurity standards and producer guides are resources designed to help farmers and producers implement effective biosecurity measures within the farm and are meant to complement existing provincial and trade association guides, manuals, and certification programs. Their purpose is to: first, define biosecurity and highlight its importance in protecting crops. Second, provide a proactive approach to managing biosecurity risks. This includes strategies to minimize the introduction and spread of pests, which ultimately saves time and resources and results in higher quality yields and lower costs. And third, describe potential risks and offer risk mitigation tools to address them effectively. As an example, pests can be introduced to a farm through various inputs such as seeds, water, and soil. To reduce this risk, it's important to use preventive measures, such as sourcing high-quality seeds or those that have been tested and verified to be pest-free. Risk mitigation is a process that will identify, assess, and reduce the impact of potential risk. In this case, the introduction of harmful pests to your farm to minimize loss. The biosecurity standards and producer guides are a practical framework for producers, equipping them with the knowledge and tools to enhance on-farm biosecurity while aligning with other industry and regional efforts. The biosecurity standards and producer guides were collaboratively developed, drawing on a wide range of expertise. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency worked with stakeholders to develop national voluntary farm-level biosecurity standards and producer guidance documents for several sectors. The development process was supported by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Growing Forward to Agricultural Policy Framework. The process included a literature review of key topics, a gap analysis of existing farm-level programs, farmer consultation, and ongoing feedback and input from the advisory group, CFIA, and industry experts. The National Voluntary Farm-Level Biosecurity Standard for the fruit and tree nut industries was developed by the Fruit and Tree Nut Biosecurity Advisory Committee, which included members from sector associations, producers, academia, and federal and provincial specialists. The standard is a national reference document which provides guidance to producers to develop their biosecurity plan. A producer guide accompanies the standard, providing more detailed commodity-specific best practices and other options to be considered to achieve the risk mitigation goals identified in the standard. As described in the National Voluntary Farm-Level Biosecurity Standard for the fruit and tree nut industries, biosecurity is essential in protecting the fruit and tree nut industries from pests. A proactive approach will minimize risks and ensure healthy crops. The standard outlines how to create a biosecurity plan and implement biosecurity measures. It highlights the importance of clear communication and training, and how site selection, including geography, location, and layout, play a key role in preventing the entry or spread of pests. The standard provides a framework for the development of individual farm biosecurity plans. These plans can enhance but not supersede existing farm-level programs, such as Canada GAP and other regional or provincial programs. Biosecurity best practices reduce the risk of pests on your farm operation by targeting the possible pathways of introduction, including nursery stock, soil, mulch, air, water, and biological and mechanical vectors. It is important to note that many biosecurity risk mitigation strategies are synonymous with integrated pest management or IPM preventative strategies. The two approaches differ in that farm biosecurity has a greater focus on practices intended to exclude pests from the farm or limit their spread and establishment. In contrast, integrated pest management primarily involves strategically using different practices to control a pest that is already present in a production system or is an imminent threat. Biosecurity is an ongoing cycle, not a one-time effort. First, you assess risks on a regular basis to stay prepared, considering pests that are present and new pests that may arrive. You then address gaps with a clear biosecurity plan and apply preventative and control measures accordingly. Finally, you monitor and gather information on pest activity, reassessing regularly to update the plan as necessary. Now we will review the key elements to take into consideration when developing a biosecurity plan. The standard highlights that there are 5 key components to be taken into consideration when developing a biosecurity plan. Information gathering, pest identification, pathways of transmission that allow the introduction and spread of pests, pest monitoring, and response plans. We will elaborate on each of these components. First, let's talk about information gathering systems. Your biosecurity plan should include a system for gathering information to allow you to identify the current and potential pest risks to your plants, as well as the pathways of transmission. This system should include a communication network that will help you gather information to identify critical points to apply biosecurity intervention that will mitigate the risks associated with pathways of transmission. Your communication network should also help you identify pests on your farm operation. You should identify various sources of information, including local resources, such as agrologists and extension workers, producer associations, fellow producers, horticulture publications, and industry meetings. Your information collection system should also include federal, provincial, and municipal government resources to provide information regarding the following: regulations and changes to regulations, requirements for inputs and outputs, farm-level programs such as Canada Gap or production guides for integrated pest management, and requirements for market access that are in addition to and may be more stringent than regulations. Finally, you also need to gather information on farm operation layout. For example, you need to identify specific routes for the movement of inputs, people, vehicles, equipment, and outputs. Locate signs to assist with directing traffic flow and increase awareness of designated areas. And illustrate the layout of your farm operation, including designated areas to assist in training new employees, directing visitors and service providers, planning future production processes, and managing pest detections. Information should be gathered on an ongoing basis, allowing you to adjust your biosecurity plan to mitigate risks as they are identified. Next, it is critical to identify the pests of concerns associated with the production of your fruits and tree nuts. There are many insects, viruses, bacteria, fungi, weeds, nematodes, and phytoplasmas that can impact fruit and tree nuts. The types of pests identified as a risk to your plants will depend on several factors, including the type of plants being grown, the potential for pest introduction, the region, climate, and production practices. The establishment of a pest requires the interaction of a susceptible host, a pest, and an environment favorable for pest development. To effectively control or contain a pest, it must be correctly identified, and the potential pathway of transmission must be understood. Let's now consider the pathways of transmission for all pests of concern. The implementation of proactive biosecurity measures can mitigate the potential for introduction and spread of pests if applied to a critical point in the pathway of transmission. Pathways of transmission include biological and mechanical vectors such as insects, birds, animals, plant material, and organisms in soil, as well as physical pathways, including people, vehicles, tools, equipment, irrigation, harvest containers, inputs such as propagation material, plants, soil, mulch, and outputs such as pruning debris, unharvested fruit and harvest waste, as well as packing materials. Let's have a look at some of the biosecurity measures you can implement to disrupt critical points in the pathway of transmission of biological and mechanical vectors. These would include preventing wildlife from entering production areas by using fencing and tree guards. The use of fencing or tree guards that wrap around the trunk of a tree can minimize or deter wildlife from causing physical damage to your plants. Managing vectors such as insects or nematodes by using chemical, cultural, or biological controls. Monitoring and maintaining beneficial insect populations, though keep in mind that beneficial insect can be negatively impacted by certain control measures. Removing pruning debris from production areas. Locating compost piles away from production areas as they may serve as homes for unwanted animals and pests. Ensuring proper disposal of infected fruits and nuts. Working with pollinator providers to limit the spread of viruses, such as blueberry shock virus, when using bees. And adopting crop rotation or fallowing production to reduce pest buildup that can occur when one species is continuously grown in a production area. Let's now have a look at some of the biosecurity measures that can be implemented at critical points in the physical pathways of transmission. First, it is important to eliminate inputs as potential sources of pests. Receiving inputs such as nursery stock, compost, manure, fertilizer, mulch, soil, packaging materials, or water has the potential to introduce pests to your plants. To that end, you need to ensure you are using certified nursery stock from reputable suppliers and certified for freedom from pests when available, as signs of viruses, viroids, and phytoplasmas may not be visible on dormant material. Receiving and storing inputs in designated areas located away from your production areas to prevent introduction and spread of pests to your plants. Inspecting inputs for signs and presence of pests prior to accepting or moving the materials into your production areas. Keeping purchase, production, and storage records for relevant inputs. Records of the source of inputs, numbers of plants, and date planted can be important when responding to a pest detection. Records form the basis to identify the source of origin and potential distribution of a pest. You should also ensure you are using clean potting, harvest, and transport containers. Maintaining a clean water system. Preventing any livestock or animal access to water sources used for irrigation or filling sprayers. And monitoring water quality. It is highly important not to move soil between farm operations or designated areas, as soil is a high-risk pathway for a wide range of pests. Another physical pathway is people, as pests can be carried on footwear, clothing, and hair. This includes employees, visitors, and service providers. All must respect your established biosecurity protocols when at your farm. To that end, it is important to train staff on biosecurity protocols implemented at the farm. Ensure visitors and service providers use designated parking areas and only access areas necessary for their activities. Visitors and service providers should also be briefed on biosecurity protocols at the farm. Keep a visitor's log to identify the date and areas visited. Ask visitors if they have been on a farm and their last contact with fruit and tree nuts prior to visiting your farm. This information may be useful when responding to a pest detection. Finally, ensure visitors, service providers, and employees who have been on other farm operations do not have soil or plant debris on their footwear, clothing, or hair. A third physical pathway that is critical for preventing the introduction of pests is vehicles, tools, and equipment. Vehicles, tools, and equipment entering and moving within your farm operation pose a biosecurity risk, as they can be contaminated with soil and plant debris that can harbor pests. They must be kept clean to prevent the introduction and spread of pests on your farm operations. This is why it is important to establish designated parking areas for visitors, employees, and service provider vehicles. Minimize traffic movement into farm production areas. Inspect vehicles, tools, and equipment for soil, plant debris, organic material, and insects, and if necessary, clean prior to entry and movement between farm operations or designated areas. Restrict the use of off-farm vehicles to designated access roads and prohibit access to production areas. Ensure that the vehicles are free of soil and plant debris if entry is required. Prevent the entry of recreational vehicles on the premises, particularly into production areas. Ensure that vehicles follow the appropriate routes and traffic flow patterns as established. Move from clean production areas to those more likely to harbor pests or potential biosecurity risks. And clean pruning and propagation tools, especially between areas where pest transmission is a concern. The fourth physical pathway to consider is product leaving the premises, which should be free of pests of concern. Another output you need to consider is byproducts or waste which may contain pests when leaving the farm operation and require specific disposal or treatment to mitigate the release of pests to areas surrounding your farm operation and neighboring farms. Some of the steps that need to be taken include regular monitoring for pests on the farm or harvested crop from the start to the end of the growing season. Following established industry protocols for grading, labeling, and segregation of final product, and conducting these activities in designated areas away from production areas. Ensuring your product is correctly identified and labeled for traceability in the event of pest detection, as well as spray residue issues or foodborne illness. Ensuring all infected fruit or culls are properly disposed of by deep burial, transportation to a municipal disposal facility, or other methods that minimize the risk of pest introduction and spread. Locating compost or cull piles away from production areas. Transporting byproducts, such as fruit destined to juicing or jam processing, in leak-proof, clean bins to prevent the leakage of juice as it may contain pest larvae. And knowing the pest status of the region or country receiving your product. Additional biosecurity measures may be necessary for regions that are free of a pest that is present at your farm operation. Implementation of a pest monitoring program on your farm operation will help to ensure that pest introductions or threshold limits are identified quickly and the potential for economic and ecological issues is lowered significantly. Early detection of pests is vital to minimize the impact on your production and to successfully contain or eradicate pests. Early detection of pests through regular monitoring leads to the implementation of management practices or specific pest response plans before pest populations impact market access, local economic losses, and the environment. To that end, it is important to keep your farm staff informed and trained to identify pests and other crop health issues. Your monitoring program should include activities to identify both existing and potential pests of concern. Use your information network to continuously be aware of emerging pests. Maintain accurate and routine crop scouting reports, noting the presence or absence of weeds, pests, and diseases, or other crop health issues. Reviewing these records is an essential step in evaluating and developing response plans. Inspect storage and shipping areas for signs of pests. Consult professional agrologists or other professionals, and investigate suspected problems to identify pests, and take action by implementing appropriate management practices. Correct identification of pests will help you determine the most appropriate and effective controls. The evaluation of the pest risk is used to develop your response plan. When a common pest that is not regulated is detected, there is a decision-making process to determine if a response is required, the timing of the response, and the most appropriate control. When a pest is found, control actions may not always be required as not all pests carry the same risk. The economic and ecological implications should be assessed when deciding whether to respond to a pest detection on your farm operation. The decision of whether to manage or control a pest will depend upon factors including but not limited to the biology of the pest, the availability of control measures, cost and benefit considerations, the regulatory status of the pest, and the availability of an area-wide pest control strategy. Identification and quantification of pests identified through your monitoring program provide the information to enable you to decide if you have reached your treatment threshold. A threshold is the critical point you've determined where the level of pest population may result in unacceptable economic loss or ecological impact. Thresholds are very specific and may fluctuate depending on crop, pest, growth stage of the pest, expected market value, and cost of control. Establishing a threshold and preparing detailed response plans prior to the identification of a pest may facilitate an effective response which may reduce economic loss and ecological impacts. Timely pest identification, containment, or eradication can mitigate the risk of disruption of domestic or international markets. Make sure to collect a sample and send it for accurate identification, record the location where found, and use signage to prevent further spread to other production areas. Make sure your staff follow all appropriate biosecurity measures, such as cleaning footwear, tools, and equipment, and apply pest control measures as necessary. When a regulated pest is identified, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency and your respective provincial or territorial government must be contacted to report the detection. The standard has a section dedicated to communication, education, and training. A well-developed, communicated, and implemented training program will convey the need for biosecurity to visitors, service providers, and employees. The target outcome is to ensure all people entering or working within your farm operation respect the biosecurity measures in place. What you will need to take into consideration is to train all staff to implement the farm biosecurity protocols. Schedule training as needed. Staffing changes, newly identified risks or emerging pests, and changes in operational practices are a few examples of triggers that would identify the need for training in addition to routinely scheduled training sessions. Make a copy of the biosecurity plan accessible to employees. Ensure visitors and service providers are made aware of biosecurity protocols. Depending on the biosecurity measures, visitors and service providers may need to be accompanied by farm staff when moving through production, storage, or shipping areas to assist them in respecting your biosecurity plan. Monitor, review, and change the biosecurity plan and training program as situations change and new information becomes available. For example, when you become aware of new emerging pests. And communicate biosecurity protocols to neighbors. In the last section of the standard, site selection, which includes geography, location, and layout, is highlighted as an important factor to consider when developing your biosecurity plan and measures you need to undertake at your farm. It is important to know and use the information associated with geography and environmental factors, your location and farm layout to protect your farm from pests. These would include choosing sites with reduced risk of pest introduction or spread based on wind prevalence and direction, given that wind can carry spores or insects. Ensuring the topography enables good drainage and reduced water pooling sites. In terms of location, knowing the history of the farm and what has been grown there in past years, and identifying neighboring land uses or potential host plants around the land. Using natural barriers such as roadways or neighboring farm boundaries, for example windbreaks or hedges, to help control access to your site. And finally, ensuring you have a proper farm layout where there are designated areas for production or storage and cleaning of equipment and tools, and receiving areas for inspection of crop inputs would minimize introduction of pests to your farm. At the end of the standard, in an appendix, there is a self-assessment checklist to assist you in conducting a self-assessment of the biosecurity measures currently in place on your farm operation. The self-assessment checklist will help you to identify areas where biosecurity measures may be required. It also provides a framework for the development of your biosecurity plan. It is important to carefully evaluate whether a biosecurity measure is applicable or not to your farm. It is recognized that not all measures will apply to each of the various commodities and production types included in the scope of the standard. The standard is also accompanied by a producer guide. The producer guide for fruit and tree nut producers has been developed as a supporting document to help you develop your biosecurity plan. This guide is voluntary and provides best practices and biosecurity measures for consideration to help producers achieve the biosecurity and pest risk mitigation goals identified in the standard. Not all biosecurity measures included in this guide may apply to each commodity or farm. To develop an effective plan for your farm, you must identify the pests of concern and analyze their pathways of transmission for your specific commodity and place of production. It is important to note that this producer guide does not address risks and concerns related to food safety and quality. We would like to thank the Fruit and Tree Nut Biosecurity Advisory Committee for developing the standard and producer guide for the fruit and tree nut industries. We are also thankful to the Canadian Plant Health Council and the Biosecurity Working Group for their expertise, guidance, and contributions to these video podcasts. Finally, our special thanks go to all fruit and tree nut producers for your daily effort to protect your farms from plant pests through the implementation of on-farm biosecurity measures.